just a note. I don't think we should never be afraid of emotions. It's not very English. I'm an English man brought up not to be emotional about anything. But when we read a passage like this, if we don't have some emotional response to it, we haven't understood it, or there's something very wrong with us. And again, we will get there in a moment. Do you ever feel that for you life can be a bit of a battle? I guess that's true for most of us at some point. Sometimes life is hard work. We try and do the right thing. We try and do what's good, and we find it such hard work. It would be so much easier to do something that's perhaps not so good. Sometimes it's just hard to do the right thing. Don't ever believe that doing the right thing should always be easy. It just isn't. There's always temptation to give in and to do the wrong thing. Now, life isn't always like that. Sometimes life is great. Things go really well. And you seem to be winning on every front, and life is good. And it seems easy to do the right thing, easy to live the right way. I think that's a normal experience. Life has ups and life has downs. Sometimes more downs than ups, and sometimes the other way. It might be helpful to think of your life, and life in general then, as a power struggle. It's a power struggle, a struggle between trying to do what's right and what's good versus not wanting to do what's wrong and what's bad, and the two meet, and we struggle when they meet in the middle. We might think of it as a good against evil, or right against wrong, and sometimes we win, and sometimes we don't. That is life. Hopefully we win, or good wins, more times than not. Now, it's an interesting way to think about life, to think about our experiences, but it is a way for thinking through human nature and society and politics that underlies a lot of contemporary thinking. A lot of contemporary ideas see society, life, through the lens of power struggles. Actually, don't be put off, but that actually has its roots in Marxism, which saw life as a hierarchy, saw society as a hierarchy, top and the bottom. Those who are struggling to gain power over those who are over them, and those who are struggling to maintain power over those beneath them. Life is a hierarchy. Only those at the top have no one oppressing them, and only those at the bottom have no one to oppress. That's the basic premise of the way this theory works. So the point of life then becomes a power game. You know, there were all kinds of slogans, weren't there, back in the 1960s, power to the powerless and all those kinds of things. And the aim of government then becomes to change social structures to empower the powerless. I hope I'm not losing you here. I think it's quite straightforward. This is the way it works, isn't it? To empower the powerless. Ultimately, if we go all the way with Marxism, it's the powerless that want to be empowered to overthrow the powerful, and that is called revolution, which is why Marxism called for revolution. Power to the powerless to overcome those who have power. Construct a new society where everyone is equal. And of course, you will know the book Animal Farm that builds on that theory to show why it doesn't quite work. But the same kind of language is used today. We hear a lot about empowering, people being empowered. It's not always bad, but we hear it rather too much, in my opinion. Now, there's a lot more that could be said, but I don't want to get more deeper into politics and hot water. So I'm going to leave that there for a moment, and we're going to turn to the Bible, which is far easier to understand than contemporary politics. Suffice to say that what we have here in this part of John chapter 18 is a power struggle. or a series of power struggles. But who is struggling and against who? Do you remember last week we thought about Jesus being arrested in the garden? This powerful army came to arrest this one man, Jesus. The powerful army led by an empowered Judas who had just betrayed his master for money to bring down Jesus and the other disciples. He'd taken power into his own hands. And we see power in Peter when he draws his sword and strikes the ear off Malchus. The power switches to Peter at that point. The focus is off the soldiers and onto Peter. It's a battle, isn't it? The sword brings him power. We talk about the power of the sword, don't we? Well, here it is in Peter. And Peter is bold to use it. But Jesus says to Peter, no, don't do that. And Jesus is taken. Jesus, the one who in the narrative seems to be the most powerless of all, but paradoxically is actually the most powerful of all. Jesus is taken first to Annas in verse 13. He's brought before Annas, and Annas has power over Jesus here in the narrative, doesn't he? At least Annas thought he did. We know otherwise. And then Annas sends Jesus up the hierarchy to the high priest, the very head man in Judaism of the day. Jesus is sent to the high priest in verse 15. So, let's think about Peter for a moment. We've seen Peter act with power in the garden with the sword against this powerful army, thinking he's empowered to destroy this huge army. Quite what was going through his head, I've no idea. We thought about that last week. But he had the power and the will to strike out to protect Jesus. Here is Peter, so bold in the garden. You've got to admire the strength of the guy who thinks he can take on an army. There were hundreds in this army, from the words that he used, hundreds, and he's one man. You have to admire Peter's belief in his power. What a bold man. What strong conviction. And yet here, in this passage, a few hours maybe later, he is so weak. Unbelievably weak. What's changed? How can this be the same man who's striking the ear off a soldier who's denying Jesus? It's hard to see exactly what has changed, except there's one thing that's changed. Clearly, when he's denying Jesus, he doesn't have Jesus at his side, does he? When he's in the garden, he's got Jesus standing there. Gives him strength. With Jesus, Peter felt invincible. Now, alone, he feels vulnerable. But let's not be too harsh on Peter, because there is a certain amount of boldness and power in Peter's actions. Just look at verse 15. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple, since that disciple was known to the high priest. He entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. Now just ask yourselves, where are the other 9 disciples? Where are they? Nowhere to be seen. Peter's bold. He's going along with Jesus and the other disciple, who presumably feels he has some kind of protection because he knows the high priest. Peter's going because, well, why? Probably because he feels he wants to stand up for Jesus. I wonder what he thought he could do. He probably soon realised when he'd been in there just a few minutes, actually he could do very little because he was surrounded by enemies. Perhaps, again, as in the garden, he thought he could somehow defend Jesus against the high priest. Maybe he thought he'd have some kind of magical opportunity to defend Jesus. But no, that didn't happen. I wonder if Peter was honest, and if I'm honest, I wonder if the moment he walked into that courtyard and saw the setting, I wonder if he regretted his decision and he thought, oh no, what have I done? Why have I come here? This is a disaster. And when he was challenged in verse 17 by this servant girl, you also are not one of this man's disciples, are you? Peter says, no. Who holds the power in that conversation? It's a servant, a girl servant. Probably in John's day, the very weakest kind of person you could imagine. Hard for us to see that today, but in John's day, a girl who was a servant was really pretty nothing in society. And yet she holds power over Peter. And so Peter watched Jesus being questioned. He appeared to be disinterested. Look at verse 18. Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. Significant that Peter was doing exactly what those other people were doing. He was disinterested, or feigning disinterest, trying to protect his own skin, acting like the others, trying desperately not to be outed, as it were, as a follower of Jesus, desperate not to be discovered because he feared what the outcome might be. But then he was asked again, verse 25. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, you also are not one of his disciples, are you? Peter said, I'm not. And verse 26, one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off. Here is a reference to Peter's strength. Here is irony, a reference to Peter's strength, juxtaposed with Peter's weakness. A relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off asked, did I not see you in the garden with him? And Peter denied it. Here is Peter, thinking he could do something, finding he can do nothing, finding himself powerless to help Jesus as he watches him being unjustly accused, willing to try but falling on his face. Now, before we think a little bit more, we're going to think about Jesus in a moment. That's always a good thing in a sermon. Before we do that, let me ask you, how much of Peter do you see in yourself? It's so easy to read this passage and feel sorry for Peter, feel sad for Peter. Poor old Peter, look at what he went through. But just look at the way Peter was behaving here. He felt strong when things were going easy, when things were going well. Yet he failed miserably when he didn't have Jesus by his side. He was bold to support Jesus, to stand up for him when it was easy, but failed when the going got tough. As we think about ourselves, isn't it easy to try and do things in our own strength and to fail miserably. Isn't it easy to stand up for Jesus in a congregation like this, to sing the songs that we sing and sing praises to God? Yes, Jesus is my Lord. And tomorrow in the office to deny it, or at least not to talk about it. That's Peter, isn't it? So what about Jesus and this power struggle that's going on? We need to bear in mind, behind the narrative here, we have the power struggle of all power struggles. The mother of all wars. The full force of evil against the force of God himself. That's what's going on behind the way Jesus is treated here. Evil against God. This is the real battleground. How could evil ever believe it could be victorious? How could the evil one ever think he could have victory over God himself? The high priest, verse 19, then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. And Jesus answers humbly, honestly, truthfully, openly. Verse 20, Jesus answered, I've spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I've said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who've heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. Here is Jesus who had nothing, absolutely nothing to hide. He didn't have anything to cover up. There's no attempt here at deception, nor should there be. There was no deception going on. Here, Jesus lays himself open for interrogation and says, look, here I am. You know who I am. You know what I've taught. You know where I've been. You can ask for corroboration. Here I am. And in so doing, he's being led like a lamb to the slaughter. Yet Jesus goes willingly. It's unbelievable, incredible to think that this is God in human form, allowing himself to be treated like this. Consider then, Peter, he lied his way out and went free. Jesus was totally truthful and honest, yet was condemned. It's upside down, isn't it? It's wrong, and yet it's true. So why is this happening, given that God is so much more powerful than the evil one? Why doesn't God just wipe out the opposition? What is going on here? Jesus holds all the power. He could at any moment call down an army of angels to fight for him, to defeat his accusers, to show who he really is. But he doesn't. He decides instead to be obedient to his Father. In verse 11, Jesus says this, shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? Here is Jesus drinking the cup that the Father has given him. What does that mean? What does it mean, the cup? Why the cup? Well, it's because the Old Testament talks a lot about the cup, God's cup. And God's cup in the Old Testament represents God's anger against sin and rebellion, poured out on his wayward, faithless people. In Isaiah chapter 51, as an example, there are many others, but as an example we read this. Wake yourself, stand up, O Jerusalem. You who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath, who've drunk to the dregs the bowl of the cup of staggering. Here, God through Isaiah is referring to his people coming to the end of their time in exile. God is saying that was the cup of God's wrath. That was God's judgment against you. But God is always merciful, because in the same chapter, Isaiah 51, later on in verse 22, we read this: Thus says your Lord, the Lord, your God, who pleads the cause of his people, behold, I have taken from your hand the cup of staggering, the bowl of my wrath. You shall drink no more. What does that mean? How has God taken away the cup of wrath from his people? Jesus says, shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Who is to deal with this cup? God himself. Who is Jesus? God in human form. What is the cup that Jesus is being given to drink by the Father but the cup of his wrath against sin and waywardness and wickedness and evil and lying and doubting? Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? Says Jesus. He is to take God's anger against sin and rebellion, and we'll see that in the next chapters. Jesus and Jesus alone will take the full wrath of God against him. Why? So that Peter, with his lying and denial, can go free. Jesus condemned the honest and truthful one. Peter, the lying denier, goes free. And remember, as we said earlier on, Peter represents so many of us, doesn't he? We deserve God's wrath and anger because we behave so often as Peter did. But Jesus takes it and deals with it on our behalf. And look at the price he was prepared to pay. As he stood before Annas and then Caiaphas, being falsely accused, he stood led like a lamb to the slaughter. So what's happening here? Peter tries in his own strength to help. He ends up lying to save his skin. He denies his closest friend. Yet he goes free. Jesus holds all the power, yet he relinquishes that power in humility. Allows himself to be falsely taken and interrogated. At every point, he is faithful, obedient to his Father, despite the cost. At no point does he use the power he has to free himself. Yet Jesus is condemned. Why? Because Jesus is to drink the cup of God's wrath. So that on that day of judgment, by faith in him alone, you don't have to. Let's bow our heads to pray.